and the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgery.
Well, hello again. Gary Stearman. Welcome to another edition of Prophecy in the News. Once again, we're going to have with us Mark Biltz, a man who is really making waves in prophetic study circles these days, I'll tell you. Stay with us. Well, Mark Biltz, welcome once again to Prophecy in the News.
Well, thank you, Gary. I'm just so thrilled to be here with you again.
You know, going back to 2008 when you were first here, and you brought a then revolutionary idea concerning what have come to be called lunar tetrads, that is, eclipses that occur in groups of four, and we'll talk about that later. When you brought that idea to us, it had such a natural feel to it, if you will. I don't know any other way to say it. Our eyes were open, and we saw God doing something that you simply couldn't deny. And yet, since you have come up with this idea and presented it in a number of venues, you do have your critics. And so I wanted to give you an opportunity, A, to talk about what it is you discovered, and B, some of the criticism that you have encountered.
Sure. Well, thank you, Gary. To me, it is so significant that these eclipses are falling on the feast days. And when I brought this out, as you said, it made waves all over the world, because now we're looking at eclipses from a biblical point of view, when they're falling on the biblical calendar. And as I said before, I don't control an eclipse. I don't control the biblical calendar. And some of the naysayers were saying that I'm setting dates or something like that. I'm not setting dates at all. I'm saying this is when NASA says the eclipse will occur. This is where they fall on the biblical calendar. Those aren't theories, those are facts. And so I like to bring that first objection out, that I'm not setting dates whatsoever. Now, one of the other objections that people have brought up over the last 5 years since I've discovered this was, well, are all four of these eclipses seen in Jerusalem? And as you and I were talking before, if everyone has a computer now, so everyone can see it from all over the world.
Yeah, and the argument being, if there are eclipses that are significant because they fall on Jewish feast dates, they must have something to do with Israel. Therefore, they would have to be seen in Israel in order to be important. That's the criticism.
Right.
And,
but, yeah.
and you're just simply making the point. We have arrived at a time when everybody sees everything at the same time. We have global video connections these days, and I can see an eclipse over Jerusalem. I can see it over Indonesia.
You're exactly right. And the other thing is this. In 1967 and 1968, when these four blood moons occurred on the feast days, they weren't all seen in Jerusalem then, but this sure was a very biblically prophetic event. And the same thing in 48 when they became a nation. In 1949 and 1950, there's four blood moons were on Passover and Sukkot, and they weren't all seen in Jerusalem. But I think Israel become a nation was a prophecy fulfilled.
Yeah, again, four blood moons in the period of Israel's statehood, in what I consider to be maybe a hallmark date in modern history, 1967, when they first set foot there on the Temple Mount for the first time in, 1,800 years.
Correct.
And you're telling me that these tetrads occurred then.
Right.
Well, what are the odds?
Yeah, right, exactly. The odds are very small. When you look at, there's only been 8 in the last 2,000 years, and at least the last 3 have been very significant. You know, and the other thing too is this: when you think about it, God loves the whole world, not just Israel. And so when he created the sun and the moon for signs, it was for the whole world, not just Israel. And so in 2014, 2015, God allows everyone around the world to see these, not just Israel. But that culminating one is the super blood moon in 2015.
Now, quickly, I want to review something that we've spoken to Mark about before, but it's so important, I wanted to reestablish the idea. When we're talking about calendrical dates, we're not talking about the Gregorian calendar, the one you use every day on the kitchen wall there. We're talking about the Jewish calendar. And it is a unique calendar in that it relies on solar and lunar input, and particularly lunar input relative to the feast days, right?
You're exactly right, Gary. Because as I said, you can only have a solar eclipse on the first day of a biblical month, but it could happen any time on our calendar.
Yes.
Same thing with the lunar eclipse, only in the middle of a biblical month.
And that's a very, very important point to remember as we go on into some of these dates we're going to be talking about. Again, Mark Biltz is the man behind all of the excitement. And by the way, as we approach 2014, 2015, I expect the excitement to mount, don't you?
Oh, I think it's going to be huge, and I'm very excited about the Orlando conference again, just because that's a few weeks before the first one.
Well, since you brought up the Orlando Prophecy Conference, I just want to say that we're going to be talking as fast as we can on today's broadcast, but there's no possible way we can get in all the facts and figures that Mark has, and he's going to be making a huge presentation there March 28th through 30th at the Orlando Prophecy Conference. And by the way, you need to find out about this conference if you don't know about it already. Gary Stearman with a word about the upcoming Orlando Prophecy Summit, March 28th through 30th. It's going to be fabulous, Bob.
It's going to be the Prophecy Conference for the Ages. 24 speakers in sunny Orlando, Florida. The sunshine, the beaches, Disney World, Universal Studios, the Holy Land theme park, and 24 incredible speakers.
Like Chuck Missler, Bill Salas, L.A. Marzulli, and, by the way, Mark Biltz.
Don't forget Mark Biltz. 2 weeks before the blood moons hit Israel, Mark Biltz is going to be speaking at our conference. L.A. Marzulli, fresh off his trip to Peru, his hunt for the skulls and the skeletons of the Nephilim. It's going to be fabulous.
Bob, for our viewers in the southeastern United States, this is a one-day drive to a beautiful hotel, and we're going to have the most fabulous get-together you can possibly imagine. Be with us. Call the 800 number right now, 1-800-475-1111. We'll see you there. Well, Mark, let's go back now, and let's talk about the dates themselves. I would just like to go through the calendar dates we're talking about to give everybody a kind of a view of what it is that we're dealing with here, the proximity of these dates.
I think it's very important. Well, in 2014, it's going to be on tax day, April 15th.
April 15th.
April 15th, that's when we're going to have the first total blood moon. And then following that, on October 8th,
Okay.
that's on the Feast of Tabernacles, will be another total blood moon.
Again, for us who just use the Gentile calendar, the Gregorian calendar on the wall, it's no particular date. But in the Jewish calendar,
This is huge. This is why you need to get a biblical calendar that overlays the Jewish holidays with our normal calendar. So you can, I used to live in Garden City, Kansas. And in Garden City, we're right on a time zone between Central and Mountain Time.
Right.
And people had to have 2 clocks because they could go to their neighbor and it's an hour later, even though it's a nice walk. Okay, so we need to realize we need 2 calendars. We need the Gregorian calendar for our normal business activities. But if you want to know what God's doing, you got to be on his calendar. So we've combined the 2 in one calendar.
Okay, so you have April 15th of 2014, and then in October,
The 8th is another blood moon on Sukkot.
that will be a total lunar eclipse.
Yes.
And a total lunar eclipse is when if you've ever seen one of these, you go out and the moon begins to disappear slowly, and when it becomes total, almost amazingly, it turns a dark blood red color.
Exactly.
So when the biblical expression, the moon shall turn to blood, is used, it's really not a metaphor, it's a description.
It's the plain meaning of the text. And then guess what? On Nisan 1, now most people don't know when Nisan 1 is. This is why you want to be on a biblical calendar. But next year, it is March 20th of 2015. Nisan 1 is the day Moses set up the tabernacle, the grand opening ceremony, and the fire falls from God and lights the fire. Well, there's a total solar eclipse that begins the religious calendar year in 2015, and it's on March 20th. And then just 2 weeks later, on April 4th in 2015, is a total blood moon on Passover. This is followed
And that would be what date in the Gregorian calendar? The
April 4th.
April 4th.
Yeah, April 4th of 2015 is a total lunar eclipse. That is followed by another solar eclipse on Rosh Hashanah, which falls on September 13th. This is a partial solar eclipse.
But Rosh Hashanah is a huge, tell everybody about what Rosh Hashanah is in the Jewish calendar. It's a huge day.
It is huge. It's also known as the Feast of Trumpets. It is believed within Jewish teaching that this is the day that Adam opened his eyes for the first time and saw all of creation, and he crowned God as his king. See, the animals can't crown God as king. So Rosh Hashanah is the king is crowned. And so
It's
I
a
believe
day of sort of a new birth, if you will.
Exactly.
But it's called Yom Teruah, the day
Yes.
of the great trumpet blast. Well, there you go. What a
Oh, that's huge.
And-
This
and-
is huge prophetically.
prophetically, it could speak of God's judgment of the world.
Oh, exactly. I think you're exactly right. And in the feast DVDs I have, I go into 6 different names of Rosh Hashanah and the prophetic significance. But this is why we need to be aware of the biblical calendar so we know what events will happen on those days. Well, then 2 weeks later, after that partial solar eclipse, is the super blood moon, and it will fall on September 28th on our Gregorian calendar.
Say that one again. The date is going to be
September 28th of 2015 is the super blood moon on the Feast of Tabernacles seen in Jerusalem.
Now, we explained the last time we talked with Mark, we explained what a super moon is because, surprisingly, when the moon orbits the Earth, it's an elliptical orbit. Sometimes it's closer than others, meaning it would look bigger. But here we have the confluence of an eclipse with a giant moon, that is, it's close to the Earth, with a particular date.
And seen in Jerusalem.
And seen in Jerusalem.
Yeah, on a feast day. This is literally something of astronomical proportions.
It's something that is beyond coincidence. Let's put it that way, in my opinion.
Oh, I totally agree. And when in Genesis 1:14, God said he created the sun and the moon for signals on his feast days, and then to have these 4 blood moons on the feast days, I think God is sending us a signal that something very biblically prophetic will be taking place.
Okay, now we have talked about upcoming and amazingly rare upcoming eclipses in the years 2014 and 2015. And you may be sitting there right now, if this is the first time you've been exposed to this idea, and saying, well, what's the big deal? Well, tell them what the big deal is, because this has happened in the past.
Yes.
And every time it happened, some very significant events transpired.
Well, definitely, as we've talked about in 48, as we've talked about in 67. But I think the other big thing as far as the biblical calendar is the Shemitah year. And in 2001, which was a Shemitah year, now for the listeners that don't know, every 7th year the land of Israel had to rest. And it's because Israel didn't do that, they had to go into captivity. Well, in 2001, at Rosh Hashanah, the Dow falls 7%. And exactly 7 years later, another Shemitah year, right at Rosh Hashanah, the Dow falls 7%. That's where the big catastrophe economically happened in 2008. Well, now we go to the next Shemitah year, which is in 2015, and we have all these eclipses. The 2 things that I'm saying could, I'm not saying will happen, I'm not prophesying this is going to happen, but I see the signs or the signals is a biblically prophetic war in Israel, and global economic catastrophe potentially could happen. And we already see these things happening in the news right now between what's going on in Syria and Iran, as well as the American dollar collapsing.
You know, Mark, this would be a good spot, I think, to introduce one of my favorite biblical ideas, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 1, where Paul writes, "But of the times and seasons, brethren, you have no need that I write unto you." And the first time I ever read that verse, I said, what? Please write to me and tell me about this. But he says, no, you don't have any need that I should write to you. And I said, well, why? And it took me years to figure out why. And tell us why there's no need for him to write to us.
Oh, I think the reason why is they understood it. They had the biblical calendar.
Exactly. They had something that in the interim was lost. During the diaspora, during the years of Israel being away from the land, we just drifted away from that whole idea, and now we're coming back to it since Israel is back in the land.
I think you're exactly right, Gary. That's what I'm so excited about being here and letting your listeners or watchers know is that one of the things that God wanted to restore is a biblical calendar. We've gotten off of it, and when it says the times and the seasons, it's specifically referring to a Jewish idea of the feast days, of the biblical calendar.
The feast days were established by the Lord
Yes.
as a pattern, if you will, a grid work into which other things may be placed, but always within that particular framework.
Exactly. So the thing that's I really want to get across is in these last days, I know because you're prophecy in the news, all of your people that are follow you are into biblical prophecy. And I think God is honoring everybody by allowing us and unlocking the code to understanding this by having us all of a sudden realize we've been on the wrong calendar. And so when we interweave these two calendars together, then as we watch the news and we see things happen, we know whether this is just an anomaly or if God is involved.
Now, this is amazing. And what Mark has discovered, maybe I should say rediscovered, something that probably was understood much more clearly back in the days of the prophets and the apostles, but was sort of lost. But what you have rediscovered is the idea, literally from the initial words of the Torah, that is the 5 books of Moses, that God works within a prescribed framework, and to those who are obedient to him, he reveals what that framework actually is. And this is something that I think's been rediscovered in our era, and you have been an instrument in one particular part of it.
Well, thank you. Because when you think about it, the Gregorian calendar by Pope Gregory was based on the Julian calendar,
Right.
Which was totally based on the sun. And then you have
Absolutely.
the Muslim calendar, which is totally based on the moon. But in Genesis 1:14, God said, let them, not one or the other, but let both of them determine the biblical calendar. And so the Jewish calendar, the biblical calendar, is the only one that incorporates both. And when it comes to prophecy, that's the one we have to be on to know what God's doing.
So it is a prophetic calendar.
Yes,
And
exactly.
by the way, it's not an easy calendar to master because it has some intricacies, and it has to be adjusted periodically, and you need to study it. And my suggestion would be that you sort of begin to familiarize yourself with it, particularly as we're going into 2014, 2015. Now, having said all this, let's go back then to 1492.
Sure.
And let's just rebuild the past, coming right up through to the present day. And if you haven't heard this, you really need to listen. In 1492, of course, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We all learned that in grade school, right? But that was a horrific year for the Jews. And it's marked in the sky, if you will.
Yes, exactly. This is when King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain decided to kick all the Jews out of Spain. It was on the 9th of Av, that very historic date. And then all of a sudden in 1493 and 1494, we have these 4 blood moons that happen on Passover and Tabernacles. In 1493, all the Jews were kicked out of Portugal. You know, and the one thing I found out in dealing with the Jewish people, they know church history better than a lot of the church does. They really, these events are stuck in their mind.
Yeah, and so now think about this, something major happening to Israel marked in the sky. And let's move forward then to the next lunar tetrad, or 4 blood moons.
But that's what's so incredible. Here it was 1493, 1494, and then in the 1500s, okay, there were 7 times that there were tetrads, 4 blood moons, but none of them fell on the feast days.
Ah,
Okay.
okay.
And so that's
important. None of them fell within the Jewish calendar on significant feast days. You want to make sure you caught that.
Right. And then there were none in the 1600s, none in the 1700s, none in the 1800s. And then all of a sudden in the 1900s, Israel becomes a nation, and here they come. Israel captures Jerusalem, and here they come. And so this is the 3rd one just within the last 100 years. First off, to think there's been 8 over the last 2,000, but 3 groups of 4 tetrads are happening within a 100-year time frame. This is just unbelievable. And I know that we're living in prophetic times.
Oh, yeah.
So to have 3 tetrads all within 75 years on biblically prophetic dates on the Jewish calendar, I think this is like God with the big billboard in the sky. Is anybody listening? And if those that have a prophetic ear need to be hearing that this is God trying to tell us something.
And I can hear the words of Paul echoing in my ears right now. But of the times and the seasons, brethren, you have no need that I write unto you. Why, that's first. Now I understand what Paul was saying. You know these times and seasons.
That's why it's so important for Christians to get on the biblical calendar so they can watch as the news unfolds. One of the funnest things I like to do is whenever a big news event happens, man, I go right to that biblical calendar and see what day it is and to see if this is God talking to us.
Speaking of which, and I wasn't going to do this, but I'm going to pick up my Bible, and because Paul continues in 1 Thessalonians 5, and he says, "For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night." And then I'm going to drop down to verse 4. He says, "But ye, brethren, are not in darkness, that that day should overtake you as a thief." In other words, Paul is clearly saying, you have enough information to know when that day is approaching. And that's precisely what you're talking about, isn't it?
You're exactly right, because as we said earlier, God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. If he fulfilled all the spring feasts to the day of his first coming, he'll fulfill the fall feast to the day of his second coming, and the next feast to be fulfilled is the Feast of Trumpets, or Rosh Hashanah. And so how will you know if this big prophetic event that's happening, if it's God or not, is it falling on Rosh Hashanah? So we need to know when Rosh Hashanah is on our Gregorian calendar. So if some event happens, we'll know, wow, this is God.
You know, I'm just staggered by this. I hardly know what to say next, and yet we have to keep talking because we're doing this on prophecy in the news, and I'm just sitting here thinking about all these things, and my head is spinning, and I'm saying, we're there.
Yeah.
We're there. That's what we have to tell people. There's a big argument in the church right now, and I'm familiar with it because I talk with many people all around the world, and the argument runs something like this. You know, Israel has come back. Yes, we know that, and Israel's God's timepiece, but we're not really sure that prophecy has been fulfilled up to this point. Maybe the stage is being set, but prophecy really hasn't been, quote unquote, fulfilled. Now, you would differ with that, right?
I would totally differ with that. I think the fact that Israel became a nation is a prophecy fulfilled where till a nation be born in a day. You know, I think Jerusalem being recaptured by Israel is prophecy being fulfilled of Psalms 102, that when the Lord will build up Zion, that's when he'll appear in his glory.
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree more. And Zion, we all know what Zion is. As a matter of fact, if you really want to know what Zion is, listen to the voice of the enemy. And they refer to Israel as the Zionist Satan.
Right. They're the little Satan and we're the big Satan.
And the Zionists, Zionism must be destroyed. That's a cry you hear from the whole world. The enemy knows who Zion is.
And that's the whole spirit of the Antichrist. Because think about it, the devil always overplays his hand. He didn't want Israel becoming a nation, so he had the Holocaust. Well, as a result, Israel becomes a nation. And I think it's the same thing. The reason why the devil doesn't want Israel to have their whole nation, he's trying to divide it, as Joel says, you better not, or God will judge those nations that try to divide it, is because he's trying to thwart the Messiah's coming. But that ain't going to happen.
Well, Mark Biltz's ministry is called El Shaddai Ministries, and he has prepared this calendar, and it will prepare you to be observant of the coming signs in the heavens. What we have here in this calendar is, and I guess that you're calling this the blood moon calendar. Let me turn it around and get it facing the camera correctly. Got a picture of a blood moon up here in the corner, but in the calendar itself, you have the calendar that everybody's familiar with today, superimposed with the Jewish calendar, superimposed with the blood moons, so that you can actually look and see when and how these things are going to happen. And by the way, we're going to make this available to you as part of a package which we're calling the Blood Moon Package. The next item is a book that Mark has prepared called The Feasts of the Lord, going through all of these feasts, the significance thereof, the prophetic significance in particular, and that's accompanied by a 5 DVD album also called The Feasts of the Lord. We're offering this to you for $49.95 plus shipping and handling. You will profit by the information that you receive in this package. Again, it's called the Blood Moon Package. Ask for that package when you call the 800 number on your screen. They'll know what you're talking about, the Blood Moon Package. But that we're not finished yet, because absolutely free, we're going to throw in this DVD presentation that Mark Biltz did last July in Colorado Springs at the Pikes Peak Prophecy Summit. And so you have 4 items in the Blood Moon Package, all of them for just $49.95, beginning with that calendar, which we're showing you on the screen as you watch, the book, the DVD set, and the bonus DVD, where Mark actually delivers this lecture with a lot of visual aids. PowerPoint, you can see the charts, the graphs, the figures. You can actually see with your eyes what a supermoon is instead of just hearing somebody talk about it. And Mark, I think people will be really excited to receive this package.
Oh, I know they will. I know they will, because it has, I believe it is for this time. God is wanting to restore back to the body of Messiah his biblical calendar. And I also want you to know I'm so excited about Orlando coming up.
Oh, listen, it's going to be great. March 28th through 30th, Orlando, the Prophecy Conference. Mark's going to be one of our featured speakers, and you don't want to miss that. Going out, we've got about another minute. What's on your heart to say to folks in these days in which we live?
I think we need to keep looking up. You know, I really think we need to be watching. God wanted us to be watchmen. He doesn't want us to not understand the signs of the times. Like I said, he rebuked the leaders of the day because they weren't aware, but there were a lot that were aware.
That's true.
And so I believe that we need to be listening. God is shouting, and we need to be listening.
It's fascinating, and if you've been a follower of Prophecy in the News over the years, you know that we have tried to raise the consciousness of prophecy students to the idea of the feasts of Israel, the Jewish calendar, the anniversary dates that keep rolling around, and every time they do, we see something amazing happen, Mark, and it's not going to quit. In fact, if anything, I think that we're picking up speed right now, don't you?
Yes, most definitely.
Well, Mark, I wish you Godspeed in your journey as you tell people about this. You're going to be speaking in various places, continuing to write, and maybe you can come back and talk to us again on Prophecy in the News.
I would love it. Thank you so much.
Mark Biltz, he's somebody to watch these days, I guarantee it. You'll be hearing his name in the future. I'm Gary Stearman, reminding you, keep looking up. Prophecy in the News is a viewer-supported program made possible by our many friends around the world. Be sure you tune in every day for breaking news and our daily prophetic news updates at prophecyinthenews.com, or follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/prophecyinthenews.